Today's sermon is titled Passionately Pro-Choice, to be delivered by Susan Landau. Susan began her career as a banker, following in her father's footsteps, and remained in banking for many years. She then tried a stint at the Shasta County Jail as a law enforcement clerk. From there, she became involved in the women's rights movement and worked in women's productive healthcare for 25 years in both California and Washington states. Up until recently, Susan was a member of the UUCC, having moved to Cambria in 2012. Last October, she moved to Port Townsend, Washington, in order to be closer to 3 of her grandchildren. Susan.
So good morning. Oh man, I miss you all this morning. I was supposed to be there, but unfortunately had to postpone this trip, but I will be coming back just to visit. Some of you may remember that I previously delivered a sermon here in honor of the 43rd anniversary of the passing of Roe v. Wade. That was January 2016, just 6 years ago. At that time, I cautioned about how the right to privacy and abortion was being chipped away on our country, as it has been since the passage of Roe v. Wade. When I offered to do this sermon, I thought I could just resurrect that old sermon. But Friday, June 24th of this year changed everything. Life as we had come to know it in a free country changed when the U.S. Supreme Court essentially ruled that women are now second-class citizens without the right to privacy, self-determination, bodily autonomy, and safe medical procedures. They killed Roe v. Wade with the stroke of a pen and took this country back 50 years in an instant. The fact is that prior to this recent decision, abortion was illegal in our country for a block of time lasting about 75 years. Prior to that, abortions occurred regularly and without national debate. They were part of women's lives. Abortion and contraceptives were legal before the Civil War. Reproductive health care was provided by female midwives made up of about 50% Black women, with the remainder split between Indigenous women and white women. Medicine as a profession was taking root in Europe and then spread to the US. Women were systematically and deliberately being excluded from universities and from providing health care. The medical profession became actively engaged in the elimination of female healers, which was mostly done by discrediting women and their knowledge. A part of this discrediting was comprised of racist and misogynistic smears designed for political persuasion so as to achieve legal reform. Black midwives were described as unhygienic, barbaric, ineffective, non-scientific, and unprofessional. At the root of these stereotypes were explicit efforts to destroy midwifery and promote white supremacy. Dr. Joseph DeLee, who was a preeminent 20th century obstetrician and a fervent opponent to midwifery, stated in a much quoted 1915 speech entitled Progress Toward Ideal Obstetrics, in which he said, quote, "The midwife is a relic of barbarism. In civilized countries, the midwife is wrong, has always been wrong. The midwife has been a drag on progress of the science and the art of obstetrics. Her existence stunts the one and degrades the other. For many centuries, she perverted obstetrics from obtaining any standing at all among the science of medicine. And even after midwifery was practiced by some of the most brilliant men in the profession, such practice was held opprobrious and degraded," end quote. Gynecologists explicitly revealed their motivations in undermining midwifery. They desired the financial gains, recognition, and a monopoly on healthcare. As Dr. DeLee wrote in a 1916 article published in the American Journal of Obstetrics and Disease of Women and Children, quote, There is high art in obstetrics, and that it must pay as well as for surgery. I will not admit that this is a sordid impulse. It is only common justice to labor, self-sacrifice, and skill, end quote. They believe that men should be paid, but not women, and particularly not Black women. Abortion and reproductive care was part of midwifery practice. As an effort to discredit midwives, the practice of abortion was demonized as an abomination. I'd like to read a brief history of abortion from Our Bodies, Ourselves, a classic resource book that women of all ages still turn to for information about every aspect of their well-being. Over several centuries and in different cultures, there's a rich history of women helping each other to abort. Until the late 1800s, women healers in Western Europe and the US provided abortions and trained other women to do so without legal prohibitions. The state did not prohibit abortion until the 19th century, nor did the church lead in this new repression. In 1803, Britain first passed anti-abortion laws, which then became stricter throughout the century. The US followed as individual states began to outlaw abortion. By 1880, most abortions were illegal in the US, except those necessary to save the life of the woman, something that we don't have now. But the tradition of women's rights to early abortion was rooted in the US society by then. Abortionists continued to practice openly and with public support, and juries refused to convict them. Abortion became a crime and a sin for several reasons. A trend of humanitarian reform in the mid-19th century broadened liberal support for criminalization because at the time abortion was a dangerous procedure done with crude methods, few antiseptics, and high mortality rates. But this alone cannot explain the attack on abortion. For instance, other risky surgical techniques were considered necessary for people's health and welfare and were not prohibited. Protecting women from the dangers of abortion was actually meant to control them and restrict them to their traditional childbearing role. Anti-abortion legislation was part of an anti-feminist backlash to the growing movements for suffrage, voluntary motherhood, and other women's rights in the 19th century. At the same time, male doctors were tightening their control over the medical profession. Doctors considered midwives who attended births and performed abortions as part of their regular practice a threat to their own economic and social power. The medical establishment actively took up the anti-abortion cause in the second half of the 19th century as part of its effort to eliminate midwives. Finally, with the declining birth rate among whites in the late 1800s, the US government and the eugenics movement warned against the dangers of race suicide and urged white, native-born women to reproduce. Budding industrial capitalism relied on women to be unpaid household workers, low-paid menial workers, reproducers, and socializers of the next generation of workers. Without legal abortion, women found it more difficult to resist the limitations of these roles. I wanted to provide this background because the concept and the foundation of the anti-abortion movement is something that, as a young 34-year-old, I had never considered or even thought about. It is my guess that most people are unaware that the anti-abortion movement is rooted in white supremacy, the control of women, and the advancement of back then, a male-dominated medical profession. I was hired to manage the Feminist Women's Health Center in Redding, California in 1985. I arrived with a background in banking, 1 year as a law enforcement clerk at the Shasta County Jail, and my political innocence completely intact. I was able to convince the administrators that I could apply my background in management and my natural ability to write to any environment, including medicine and abortion. After I jumped up on my soapbox and told them how much I believed in a woman's right to choose, they decided to take a chance and hire me. At that time in my life, I was completely and deliberately non-political and incredibly naive about what was taking place in the political world and in particular, the abortion world. I knew that I would be dealing with picketers and anti-choice people, but I honestly believed that they only needed to be educated in order to understand the significance and importance for women of keeping abortion safe and legal. Please remember, this was 1985. As a result of my belief, one of the first things I did was to call a press conference at the clinic. I had written a heartfelt and passionate letter to the protesters, explaining to them the emotional and detrimental effect their presence and actions of name-calling and yelling epithets had on the women who were coming into the clinic seeking services. They would yell at the women, sometimes with bullhorns, to shame them, belittle them, and humiliate them, believing that as they did so, the women would not come in. It was verbal abuse and bullying at its finest. In my innocence and being new to the abortion rights movement, I thought that the picketers just didn't understand the necessary and cruel burden their actions were inflicting on women. I thought that if only they knew the hurt and emotional damage they were creating in an already difficult time for these women, that they would have their aha moment and stop doing what they were doing. I believed that they would suddenly have compassion for the women coming into the clinic, and that they would want to support rather than judge, belittle, humiliate, and shame them. So we held a press conference. My first. Copies of the letter I had written were handed to each picketer who was there that day while the press took pictures. Local TV stations and local newspapers interviewed me. With nothing but a strong belief and a well-written, heartfelt letter, I innocently and unknowingly catapulted myself into the middle of the abortion battle in Redding, California. I became the face of abortion. The verbal retaliation I received from the antis was such a shock to me. It didn't take me long to begin to understand that the anti-choice people outside of the clinic didn't notice that there was a woman in this picture. They only saw the potential for a baby and a way to keep women in their place. They did not give credit to any woman for having any intelligence. They had no compassion for the woman's situation at all. Not for her inability to care for a child, for her autonomy and ability to know what was the right decision for her own life in her own situation. There was a strong element of judgment and punishment, not to mention cruelty. If you become pregnant and you are not married, then you need to be punished for having had sex by being forced into motherhood. If you become pregnant and are married, then you must have a child regardless of the circumstances to your marriage and family. It was and still is all very black and white. The women and their situations were completely insignificant and non-existent. The women were just incubators with no inherent rights, no voice, and certainly no ability to know what was best for them. For myself, I learned quickly that it was not mine to decide if a woman's reason was good enough. Her reasons are her reasons and none of my business. Again, not mine to judge. If you think it all the way through, I realized, did I want to be the one to stand in the doorway of the clinic and decide for each woman who was coming in whether or not her reason was valid? Was I willing to refuse services based on my personal opinion or beliefs and sentence that woman to go home and have a child she was unable to care for, did not want, or would she possibly go home and attempt to perform her own abortion, risking her life? I learned to trust women completely, to provide them with neutral information and step out of the way as they made their own decisions. Women know what is best in their own situation, period. It took me a while longer to realize that the great majority of picketers were men. There were surprisingly few women. I came to realize that these were men, and I figured this out based on their actions. These were men who were threatened by a woman having power to control her own life. If these men could not control women and force them to be dependent on them, they felt endangered. Again, this was 1985. They feared feminists and accused us of hating men, of being witches and of being lesbians, as if that were somehow evil. But the knowing and understanding I took away from this was, if a woman can control her own reproduction, she has the freedom to control her own life. It's not about babies. It never was. A fetus is not a baby. It's about the woman. It's about women's lives and women's rights. For many, many years, I witnessed and experienced what women go through when they find themselves carrying an unwanted pregnancy. Perhaps it's financial. Perhaps she's 14 years old and molested by a family member. Maybe she's in an abusive relationship. Perhaps she already has 4 children and no partner. And perhaps she's 56 years old. There are a multitude of reasons, more than you can imagine, as unique as each woman, for which women decide to choose abortion. I wish now I had kept a journal and written a book. For some women, abortion is a clear decision, and they have absolutely no doubt about which course to take. For the majority of women, there's a process. She doubts herself. She beats up on herself. She's angry and judges herself for being so stupid. Perhaps she has already had an abortion and somehow having another one makes her a worse person. Am I careless? Is this God's will? Perhaps she considers herself pro-life and may even pick it outside of a clinic. Now here she is, seriously considering doing what she has always claimed was murder. And yes, those women I just described do have abortions. Then strangely enough, they show up on the picket line again the following week. They are able to rationalize their own circumstances, are somehow different, that they will be forgiven, but they continue to judge all of the other women who come to have abortions. Most women dig deeply into themselves when they are contemplating abortion. It's a process, a decision that is never entered into lightly. It is not about whether or not her prom dress will fit in 3 weeks. It is not a cavalier decision. It is a time of soul searching about each woman's personal belief system, her faith or spirituality, her life situation, her support network, her options, her family, her life. And when women make appointments and would come into the clinic, the majority of women had already made their decision, including who they needed to involve in making that decision. They were not looking for anyone inside or outside of the clinic to give them advice or tell them what they needed to do. As a feminist clinic, we never asked women to justify their decision to us. We would ask if she was firm in her decision, and we verified that she was not being coerced. We provided neutral, factual information about the procedure, and we supported each and every woman's ability to make her own decision, whatever that decision was. And we helped her get whatever she needed based on her decision, whether that was adoption referrals and information, prenatal care referrals, or abortion services. We believed in and trusted women to know what they needed in their own personal circumstances and situation. Women know. They absolutely do know. Roe v. Wade became the law of the land on January 22nd, 1973, protecting a woman's right to choose, and at long last granting bodily autonomy for more than half of the US population. Abortion was safe and legal in this country for 49 years, 5 months, and 2 days. Almost immediately, that right was under attack. On June 24th of this year, almost 50 years of chipping away at it, the Supreme Court completely overturned Roe v. Wade. When I heard the news, I was all at once overcome with despair and outrage. Even with the leaked decision and knowing it was coming, I was horrified when it actually happened. In my head, I was screaming. I was physically ill. I sat here and I wept and I raged. I thought of the battle I had dedicated my life to for 25 years. I thought of my daughters, of my granddaughters, and the assault on reproductive freedom. I thought of all the women who had passed through the doors of clinics seeking and receiving safe, legal medical services, and I experience deep dread for the future of all childbearing people in this country. For me, this all comes back to the right for women to control their own destiny. When a woman cannot manage her own fertility, she is prohibited from managing her own life. For women, any plans, dreams, and aspirations, responsibilities, or commitment, no matter how important, carry a big contingency clause built in that says, of course, until or unless I get pregnant, in which case all bets are off. Think of any professional woman you know. She wouldn't be in that role if she hadn't been able to time and control her childbearing. Sometimes birth control works, sometimes it doesn't. Think of any girl you know who imagines becoming a professional woman. She won't get there unless she has an effective, reliable means to manage her fertility. This is about respecting and recognizing the inherent worth and dignity of every person. Our first UU principle. It is about our second principle, justice, equality, and compassion in human relations. I believe there is a piece of this in each of our 7 Unitarian Universalist principles. So what has the UU done? In 1963, prior to Roe v. Wade, the UUA passed a general resolution to support the reform of abortion statutes. In 1975, the UUA passed a general resolution supporting the right to abortion. The General Resolution 1987 reaffirmed its historic position, supporting the right to choose contraception and abortion as legitimate aspects of the right of privacy. And in 1993, there was yet another general resolution passed in support of reproductive freedom. In the 2015 Statement of Conscience, the UUA has expanded the phrase reproductive rights to reproductive justice, and it now includes 4 principles. On June 24th, 2022, the UUA president, Reverend Susan Frederick Gray, issued a statement reaffirming the UUA's position on abortion. She concluded by saying, quote, "Our faith calls us to advocate on behalf of all of those who need ready access to safe, legal abortion care wherever and whenever they need it. We will not rest until that reality is true across the country. I urge lawmakers elected by officials and leaders in public life across this country to take action for gender and healthcare equity for all," end quote. In the end, I find myself actually encouraged because with this attempt to destroy reproductive freedom and the rights of women and people all over this country are speaking out, and they are speaking out loudly. Doctors are publicly reporting travesties that this ruling has caused, how women are suffering and having to travel across state lines while their lives are at risk, while they're in the process of miscarrying. I watch as we are coming together to say, no, we will not go back. Things are changing day by day since this ruling, and every day I hear of the pushback. This is not the fight that it was back in the day when it was still an uphill battle, making and keeping abortion rights legal. This is the fight to keep freedom that women have enjoyed for the last almost 50 years to control their own lives. I can only feel optimistic about where we are heading because we have the momentum and determination behind us. In the words of Margaret Sanger, no woman can call herself free who does not control her own body. No woman can call herself free until she can choose consciously whether or not she will be a mother. Thank you.